Hi, everyone, and welcome to the free Assange Online Vigil Wikileaks birthday special. My name is Taylor Hudak, and I am joined with my co-hosts Andrew Smith, Christy Doff, and Steve Poikonen. So on October 4th of 2006, Australian computer programmer Julian Assange created what became the world's most reputable and reliable publishing website, Wikileaks. And for tonight's very special vigil, we are going to discuss the website's first ever drop. Now, this drop in particular is interesting because we still are sort of unsure whether or not this is a legitimate document. However, this document and much of its context do point to the United States and other countries definitely overreaching their power. And I think as we get into it, you will be able to see that for yourselves as well. So the name of this first leak, before we get into it, is Inside Somalia and the Union of Islamic Courts. Now, to give it some context and a timeline, like I said, WikiLeaks was established in 2006, specifically October 4th. And this leak came out near the end of December, I believe December 26th of 2006. So this is the first one. And we're just going to be discussing that and sort of the implications and, the different factors that led to Somalia really, sort of suffering as a country. So I'll open it up to my co-host now, and we'll provide maybe some background on WikiLeaks if we would like to, as far as the major leaks that we are all aware of, that most people are familiar with. And then we will get into more about this leak and the details of it. I will preface this vigil with this is some very complex material, and we did work hard to sort through it and to make sense of it all so you guys would have a clear understanding as well.
Yeah, so I think one of the first big things is to actually talk about what was happening in Somalia at the time. In 2006, this was leading up to more or less what became like the end of the Somali Civil War. So there was multiple factions, and there has never been an actual united Somalia. And to my understanding, this is actually the closest that it's ever come to being a unified nation of Somalia without broken factions and separate legal entities everywhere. So you had like the northern part of the country, which is Somaliland and Puntland, if I believe, Puntland, something like that. And those are places that have largely remained like autonomous, where they're kind of self-sustaining, they're self-sufficient, but they still engage in trade and work with the outside world. And at the time, at the time of this release, one of the only places inside of Somalia that hadn't been conquered either religiously, societally, or militarily by a group known as the Union of the Islamic Courts, I believe. And the Islamic courts, what that was, is literally what it sounds like: a bunch of judges behind the scenes coming together, and all of them practicing one form or another of Sharia law, which in and of itself forms a hierarchic order, almost a state in and of itself by the way that the law prescribes power to everyone. And so what that did is it allowed for like a social underpinning to be formed that a military and militia then grew out of. And it was largely orchestrated through judicial controls where people would be like extrajudicially killed, or the UIC became the de facto government, almost enforcing petty crime laws, and then eventually becoming into the position to settle like land disputes and to become more or less the police force. So that's a little background to them, but they didn't come into prevalence until like the beginning of 2006, I believe. It may have been a little earlier than that.
They existed in some form since 2000
Okay.
and started to become more of a militarized union, or at least acted in that fashion, in 2006.
And they really filled a vacuum in what the education and the healthcare areas, and like Andrew said, been policing. And yeah, so we're at this point where this leak came out. They're really fighting for this one remaining town in Somalia.
And this town happens to be on the Ethiopian border, or near the Ethiopian border, which is significant because much of the conflict in this region, and specifically to this leak, deals with Ethiopia.
Yeah, so this area was defended by Ethiopian planes, troops, artillery, It was backed diplomatically and financially by the US and the UN because they had gotten involved in previous years and in kind of the mid to late 90s. And what they refer to as the transitional federal government was seated in this town.
And I think the better term for that should actually be to call it the transitional foreign government, because it was literally the transitional government was just UN and US backed forces, essentially. Similar to what we're seeing with like a Juan Guaido situation, where we just create a government and say, this is the person that's in charge of this country now, and then have no other backing aside from the grounds that they can gain through social manipulation, through economic manipulation, and through trying to break off elements of the military. So the UIC was very much like the Juan Guaido of Somalia at the time.
That's a good parallel to draw. And also, some of the documents in this leak, again, we're not 100% sure of its authenticity at this point, but basically it was a document that outlined the procedures for the Union of Islamic Courts to sort of take over this town. And please correct me if I'm incorrect on that, but I believe that is
so. It's basically proclaiming an Islamic Republic of Somalia, and it was written by one of the most important men at the time in the Union of the Islamic Courts. His name is Hassan Always, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. And so we'll kind of talk a little bit about him. He was somebody who he had been linked to terrorism by the U.S. Of course, we know just from the experience in the last decade or so, when the U.S. links somebody to terrorism, do we take that at face value or not? He was a decorated war hero in a war against Ethiopia in 1977. So he had this military background. At this point in time, he's in his early 60s, so he's more organizing training and strategy, and even regarded as kind of a spiritual leader in this organization and building community. But his public rhetoric had been very confrontational, very expansionist, and calling for war against the Ethiopian forces in Somalia.
And the point you bring up about terrorism, being linked to terrorism, that's significant because, of course, like Christy was saying, the U.S. claimed that he was linked to terrorism. However, in the WikiLeaks leak, the article that is published alongside the documents, it has linked to terrorism in quotes. And I think that's very significant to always question whether or not there truly is a link to terrorism whenever that's brought up, because we know that's used as a sort of method to for the U.S. to kind of abuse its power by claiming that certain groups are terrorists or related to or engaging in terrorist activity.
Quick point right there too. That's what made the Yemen bill basically ineffective. The one that they were really pleased that they got through Congress and then Trump vetoed it. It left a loophole in it that said any target that was Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda associated forces was open for fair game for drone strikes or limited surgical military strikes with boots on the ground. So they left the door wide open because if it's under the umbrella of terrorism, then it's fair game.
Right. And more about this, man, it is interesting because they did, as Christy was pointing out, he did use sort of like softer language, yet still there was an indication that he was looking to really call for war against Ethiopian forces in Somalia, for a greater Somalia. But he was also a Muslim scholar, and forgive me if Christy touched on that. He was a Muslim scholar, and he also had the ability to kind of get weapons on command if he needed them. So just to put in perspective, just a very powerful person, I would say, in Somalia.
So I'm going to put up a screen share real quick of the actual leak itself, just so everyone can kind of take a look at that as we're going through it. And then something I wanted to comment on too while I have this up on screen here is when we talk about the questioning of the authenticity, it's something that WikiLeaks actually points to directly, as they wrote up their like draft article and outline in the actual like WikiLeaks wiki section. So I just want to talk about that for a minute to kind of give a little bit of reference to what their mindset was behind this. And I'm just going to read it word for word because I don't want to try to refrain the way that they were thinking. And they were referring specifically to why this was released when they said, its reported secrecy is underscored by its final directive. Whoever leaks this information is found guilty and should be shot. But is it genuine? It is a bold manifesto by a flamboyant Islamic militant with links to bin Laden, or is it a clever smear by the U.S. intelligence designed to discredit the Union, fracture Somali alliances, and manipulate China? What is the future of Somalia? So even in releasing this information, they tried to make clear as they brought it out that it wasn't something that they inherently knew if it was correct or not, but it was important information that they had been given. And to my knowledge, this is one of the few things that they actually didn't fully verify before they had released. So it's very interesting that nothing has ever come out for or against the verification of this. So I think that's a really important thing to say, is this was more trying to provide context for what was happening behind the scenes for the shadow war in Africa than it was to say, hey, this is 100% proven fact, because they even point out the fact that it just may well be US propaganda.
Yeah, and so this came from a Chinese source that was passed to WikiLeaks in October. It says October 14th of 2006. The document is dated November 9th, 2005. So about that time, what was going on in Somalia matches about what is being drawn out here as far as the events and the strategies that they were establishing to the coming year of 2006. Many of the strategies in the document did come to fruition. So then it's kind of interesting because since there was no, WikiLeaks didn't have any direct contacts into the UIC, they didn't have a direct way to verify this. And so like Andrew said, this is where we kind of get into the point of, it's not fully verified. We were trying to do some digging to see if years later, if there was any reporting back on if this document has been verified. And so far, we have not come across that.
And what's interesting too is that despite there being this level of uncertainty, there is still so much, an unbelievable amount of transparency in the fact that they were uncertain and the lengths that they took and measures that they took to verify these documents. But like Christy was mentioning, they really had no way of doing so. I do think the timing in this is interesting because WikiLeaks is established October 4th, and they were provided this information by a Chinese source days later. Days later. That's really interesting. It could, of course, it could mean nothing. That's purely speculative. But I don't think it's far-fetched at all to say that one of the possibilities here is that this was US propaganda, because in this leak, there's also mentioning of the US using film and movies to kind of rewrite history almost in a way, as far as this one specific event that I'm sure we will get into that's mentioned in the leak.
So if this is actually authentic, this would be the first policy document of the Islamic courts that's beyond just their normal public announcements at this time that had ever made it into the international media's hands. So this being said, as the very first WikiLeak, if this is authentic, this is still a huge deal for them to get a hold of.
Yeah, exactly. It is a huge deal. And also WikiLeaks itself is calling itself media, because that's the exact phrase. International media, I believe, is the exact term that they use to describe themselves. But it would be a huge accomplishment if it was authentic. And if not, I still think it's an interesting piece of history to look back on, because it shows not only what's happening at that time, but also it points to US propaganda and the efforts that will be taken to kind of change the course of history.
And it also brings up the larger shadow wars between the US and China and Africa too. And that's something that at the bottom of their actual wiki article they talk about. because China, and this is something a lot of Americans don't even know, has spent the last.
I'd like to talk about this for a minute if we could. So
Yeah,
please.
absolutely. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah.
Take it away.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
I just, this is something that you're
Yeah.
right. Enough people don't know about, and we should spend a minute or two on it.
So I believe it was actually called the Greater China Project. And it began in like the late 90s, early 2000s as an expansionist, non-military empire building strategy for China to move and invade in so many words, Africa. And a lot of it has turned into China actually gaining control of a lot of Africa's resources through simple diplomatic and political means and economic means rather than all out war, like how the America has tried to secure the U.S. oil interests in the Middle East by simply declaring war and trying to smash everyone. China took that to Africa and did it diplomatically instead of militarily. And what this points to with coming from China was actually, it may or may not have been trying to underlie or interrupt different alliances between these Somali forces and different groups acting there in the transitional government to their connections in China. Because the Chinese at the time had just as much interest in this part of Africa as the Americans did for the ability to extract resources from it. So I think that's something that's really important too, that they kind of bring up down here at the bottom. That's about what I know generally about the Greater China Project. I don't know if anyone else has more they could add in.
Well, we've been engaged in kind of proxy wars all over Africa for the last 10 to 15 years, and what it's turned into is a race between the U.S. and China for rare earth minerals. Written into the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act is an entire section about this new rare earth mineral race, and the various ways that we can go about getting them, including smashing coal ash. Like you put coal ash itself under so much pressure that it turns into basically the same thing as a rare earth mineral, which means brand new strip mountaintop removal mining permits and all kinds of wonderful different ways for people to extract coal out of the ground so that they can burn it and turn it into rare earth minerals. But in terms of the mining operations that have been going on in Africa, you're right, Andrew. What the Chinese did is they came in with like crap tons of money and said, look at how the US does people. We would prefer to buy you instead of blow you up. We don't even have to arm both sides of this conflict to hand you this money.
All right, because the U.S. was already doing it. So they just came in and played the one side that the U.S. wanted to lose, but still armed for military manufacturer profits.
Yeah. And more often than not, if there's a government that hasn't been toppled in Africa while the U.S. has been playing escaladio around the continent, it's because they've been shored up and secured by the Chinese.
And something important too, just to kind of point this out, a lot of these rare earth minerals that they're going after are things like lithium and gold and parts that actually go into building electronics. So as we approach these conversations about like the Green New Deal and having everyone use battery-based power and solar turbines or wind turbines and solar panels and things like that, that's what this competition over Africa has been behind the scenes, is people vying for the ability for when that technology breaks to be the ones that can produce it like oil, that have access to the minerals that are required to build it behind the scenes. And so that's why these shadow wars in Africa have been going on so long and so quietly behind the scenes, because there's even not even proxy wars with US troops or with US funded rebels versus US funded terrorists. It's proxy wars literally between the US and China that no one's reporting on. Groups like this that we're talking about tonight were in direct conflict with groups funded by China. So I think that that's something that's really, really important to get out there and to have people understand, is we've been waging proxy war with China way before we got Hong Kong up in a riot and way before we started these tariff wars. Like, this is something that's been happening for 2 decades behind the scenes that no one in the media has talked about.
like not even hedges, really.
Right.
There's next to no coverage because I think it leads to a forced conversation about how quote unquote green technology or quote unquote sustainable technology is produced. And when you have to do that, you take some of the luster off of, you know, showing up to a parade and saying that that's how you're going to save the planet is by going to a parade. um and it's frustrating that people are so hesitant to cover this. I've been trying to talk about it some on Slow News Day, um but it's even harder to find um like an expert or someone who's been uh either on the ground or part of the like diplomatic corps, as it were, to go on record to talk about any of this. Like nobody wants to discuss that we have an ongoing shadow war with China, because you can tell that um there's going to be a boiling point. China wants their own petrodollar of sort. They want a petro yuan. There's a, a militaristic buildup that if they got mad enough and they linked up with Iran and Russia, it could be it could be very, very bad for millions and millions of people, because I don't trust people in the US to not go nuclear.
Absolutely. But to get back into this, to go in a
Well,
little
I
bit.
think that's another point too, is the fact that, of course, nobody's covering this. We are getting it from WikiLeaks, though. But again, yeah, I think it is important that it be out there and that we talk about this. And of course, we know that's suppressed for a reason. One of the parts of this leak, or Andrew, if you want to pick up, because this is kind of further down in the documents, but I really wanted to address the meeting that they had discussing the peace agreement with the UN, but I think that's a little bit later on.
Yeah, real quick, something I want to throw in just as a passing side note. They said in here towards the very end of the document, and I think this is something really important to highlight. And I was talking with Christy about it pre-stream. The final directive within the document itself was, whosoever leaks this information and is found guilty should be shot. And I just want to point out that warlords in Africa have a better understanding of what a whistleblower is than the DNC does during a presidential election. This was legitimately, and I mean this in all seriousness. They literally say,
Here,
and
I'll put it up on the screen.
Cool.
Okay, you got it. Okay.
Yeah.
But they use the word specifically, and is found guilty. The DNC says, let's make an example out of leakers. So I think that's a really important and nuanced point to make, is the fact that these warlords in Africa cared more about finding who actually released the information and making sure they have it right than just offing someone because they think they're the person that released it. So that's a very distinct and important difference to make as far as directives go from tyrannical organizations.
Right, and there is some talk in the actual WikiLeaks webpage about this language on, especially that last point on if that language is, exactly what they would be saying, or if it's a forger intent on smearing the Aways and the Islamic court. So yeah, there's a little bit of discussion in the actual WikiLeaks, just based on that one point alone, on if that gives credibility or if it doesn't. They don't really. The nice thing about this introduction to this leak is, and like all the leaks, WikiLeaks gives you the information, and they don't presume to know. They don't make their mind up for you. They give you the facts, and they point things out that are interesting. But they let the reader and the person who's doing the digging into this leak kind of decide for themselves. but
And
they
that's a
are kind
really
of there to
important
help
distinction
point.
that I was going to say. That's something that WikiLeaks has always done throughout all of its history too. Like it'll highlight specific pieces of information
Yeah.
and things like that, but it never says, "Hey, this is what you need to think about this information." It just shows you what that
Yeah, these are the
information is.
points of interest here. Please, make sure you are looking at this specific point. And here's kind of the two sides of the coin that we see it as.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when I was reading through this, I was expecting almost some sort of conclusion to be made, just because you sort of expect that with many articles that you read, but there isn't one here. And I think that's really important, and more journalism should be done in that way, that it is really left up to the reader to sort of make up their minds. And I think it does prompt also further discussion, like the ones that we're having right now, as to what exactly these little things mean. And does this point to authenticity? Does it discredit the authenticity of the leak itself? So I think that's a great point. If you are looking for specific answers, you are not going to get it. But I think that that's what makes WikiLeaks stand out in general, is the fact that there isn't this sort of packaging of information and determination made up for the reader.
So, and that just lends more credence to WikiLeaks is an outlet of journalism. Like this is the first, the first drop that they made, and they introduced themselves as international media. They said that every effort was made to verify this, and that these are the point and counterpoint, and these are the conclusions that we came to, but not the conclusions that you should come to. And it's interesting that the evolution of WikiLeaks went from, we nobody would get back to us to verify whether or not this man actually wrote this, although, here's what happens if he did, here's what it means if he didn't. It went from that to, holy shit, I have to personally redact 10,000 names so that these people don't wind up dead, and then even further along the way to Vault 7, to the Podesta emails, like the march that they went on to become what people are more familiar with is absolutely fascinating, I think.
I just think it's interesting to point out too that this idea of what WikiLeaks was starting to do, and not giving you their opinion, but educating you and helping point these pieces of this puzzle out. We're not used to that anymore with media. We're not used to being told to decide for ourselves and research and read, and here's some historical information that will help give you context. It's really refreshing to actually go back and read these leaks as they are intended to set a precedent for media and journalism.
And
Yeah, and almost immediately the media made it, or at least the United States government made it 100% legal to propagandize its citizens in less than a decade. And certainly for government, really quickly after the Iraq war, the Iraq war logs and the Afghanistan war diaries and collateral murder. That was late 2010. By 2012, the NDAA had legalized propaganda through US media, and that means it was written fairly shortly after those leaks, because they do the NDAA for the following year. They passed that, 2020s has already passed. It's still 2019. It passed a couple of months ago. And they start writing it pretty much at the end of the first fiscal quarter. So within months, the US government went from, okay, collateral murder happened, to legalized propaganda, secret warrant for Julian Assange, torturing Chelsea Manning. Like it was a pretty quick response. Anyone?
Yeah, so if you want to pull up, I think
There we go.
Andrew wanted to note one of the paragraphs.
Yeah, it's the third paragraph in the
Paragraph.
actual leak document itself.
But no,
Yeah.
Steve, I agree. The response is very quick in this timeline of WikiLeaks history on what the US had done.
When had this leak? Let me see if I can figure it out here. When did it actually come out?
December 26,
December 20.
2006.
Okay. So this was released about a year after the original thing was written. But I want to talk here for a minute about the third paragraph, the one that starts with, as you are all aware, the so-called transitional government formed for Somalia is hunting the Somali religious leaders and the Muslims in general. They have influenced the international community to believe that Somalia religious leaders are Al-Qaeda. You very well know this, that its agenda is to bring Ethiopian troops in order to use them and kill the Somali population. As you are aware, there are faction leaders who are fighting this government without subscribing to our vision, but it would be vital using it as a bridge. Um, so the big thing here that I kind of want to highlight is the fact that um, the way that they use the propaganda of religion and the propaganda of 9/11 and ultimately, like Steve was talking about earlier, the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, to justify covert things like this happening behind the scenes. And one of the big things here too, just to kind of pivot this back to the reason that we're talking about everything and doing these visuals, is our core fundamental freedoms. Um, I'm not a religious person. I'm more of a spiritual person. But the fact that they were calling for this to essentially be framed and could very accurately say that it was essentially a war on Muslims, because that actually dates back to the Bush era, where following the events of 9/11, he actually called the war on terrorism a crusade. And so, them using the UN and US influence to get the Ethiopians ready to actually invade and go to war and take over the Somali population was just a very real attempt to do nation building.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that that's put out there, is the fact that big part of this and a big driving factor behind these revolutionary movements that the US seeds and creates is the fact that they're going after specific religious populations. And whether or not the intent is to obliterate those populations or not, a lot of evidence says it is, and a lot of the way that they act and conduct themselves says that they are trying to just specifically target and eliminate certain Muslim communities. But there should be a pushback from the religious community on this. And I know it sounds really weird to talk about and weird to bring up in the context of war crimes, but freedom of religion is a very fundamental thing that people have just given the fuck up on and decided to not really care about all that much or go into or even ascribe to. Like, even as atheists saying, like, no, fuck religion, like, people should still have the right to believe them. And a lot of the tensions that are built up in these countries are from the US genocide of specific Muslim populations. So
Well,
I
the
think,
United States, so atheists argue for freedom from religion
right.
and don't appreciate the constant push of Christianity in the United States that is not a Christian nation, that parades itself as, or at least tries to within recent years. It is not a Christian country. Literally, a freedom of religion or from religion too is mentioned before freedom of speech, and not saying that it's more important than freedom of speech, because that's not at all what I'm saying. But the point there is that it is a fundamental right, and obviously the founders put it there for a reason. But yeah, exactly. I agree with you, Andrew. I think that there is a targeting of people of certain religious groups to eliminate them, especially in certain regions. And I think it's important to call that out for what it is. But unfortunately, that's not done because it is um, such a sinister problem. Okay, you got your article up.
Well, I'm switching it back just because we were basically talking about that anyway. It was drawing a point in the letter to start churching up the schools,
Hmm.
you know, and that that they wanted it to. It's amazing how this is laid out. The guy who supposedly or did write it is referred to as a military genius, but what his plan is basically to uh, let each clan and let each sub-clan retain their power, retain their status. They just report to them on the back end, and it makes it they're unified when they need to unify, but at least appear to be autonomous when they need to appear to be on. It's a brilliant strategy. um but I mean, again, just indoctrinate those kids early, get them early, get them, the way that I view it, at least, is abuse, but
I do. I 100% agree it is.
I agree as well.
Yeah,
I think
agree
forcing
too.
religion on any child or any person of any age, especially children, should be considered child abuse.
I think forcing any particular lifestyle on your kid is pretty fucking gross too, man.
Right. At least
Like,
after a certain age.
The indoctrination of especially specifically building it into the schooling and the public schooling is pretty gross.
yeah,
And so
I'm a little
that's-
bit surprised that we haven't seen more of that out of this current Trump administration, the bringing it back to what is it? Intelligent design.
I mean,
That's what
in a way we have, with the way that they've built up charter schools, because most charter and private schools are built upon religious institutions.
Yeah.
And the way that they're shifting funding to them, whether the schools that are inside of these religious institutions are inherently religious or not, gives these institutions more money and more power. And then the thing that no one really talks about is there was an executive order written that allows for churches to now essentially act like super PACs as far as their political reporting goes. Because previously, and I'll have to look up to find like the actual bill and all the, or like the actual order and all that stuff behind it. But essentially, churches can now act in the same way as a super PAC. So you can have billionaires now not only putting money into these shady super PACs, but donating millions of dollars to churches to try to get their political influence out, because churches can now essentially run advertisements for candidates and endorse candidates.
Can they really? They don't have to pay taxes,
for Christian
of course.
churches, or
No,
does
I
that
think
go for any other
believe
religious?
it's across the board. I don't think it's specifically Christian. I'm gonna look it up to try to find it here.
Okay, so I guess I kept mentioning that I wanted to bring this up. Now, this is provided in sort of the background information, the history section of this leak. And basically, it's pretty complex to sort of explain here, but to provide everybody with sort of like the gist of what this is, there was a meeting between the president of Somalia, who his name was President Barr. He had a meeting with his clan, and again, when I say clan, like Somalia is a very clan-based country in general. So that's the terms that they use in the leak as well. There was a meeting, and during this meeting, they were discussing peace agreements with the UN. At this time, the US claims that it received intelligence that aided, which was the current president at this time, was planning attacks that would be detrimental to the United States. And so the United States then bombed the location of this meeting while it was taking place. And many people died. They say that there was like 1,000 to 1,500 people who died. This included civilians as well as militants. And they created a movie about this called Black Hawk Down.
Yes.
Yeah, and basically it was a propaganda piece. It was about this specific operation that really failed to address these major problems with this operation. So to me, when I looked at this, I thought, oh, that's really interesting that they received intelligence that there was going to be an attack planned, when really they were talking about a peace agreement. So I wanted to address that. And this, I'm not exactly sure what year this happened, but it had to have happened before 1995.
Yeah, this is in the section 92 to 95. I'm not sure if there's a specific year listed in this. We might have it in some of the background information.
But yeah, the US even like created a movie about this. And we see that happen today with like Chris Kyle and other movies where they fail to really address the full story. But it is really, when I read that, it just stuck with me because
Yeah,
they were trying to negotiate a peace agreement. And
I,
who
I
knows what have come from that, but
yeah, I saw that movie when it came out, and I don't have a lot of, I don't remember a lot of details, but I definitely don't remember hearing anything about there were like peace talks going on, and it definitely portrayed the American soldiers as sort of these unsung heroes that went through this awful experience, and yeah, that's sort of an interesting tie-in to this, to once again some more Hollywood propaganda with our war movies that we receive.
so it makes me wonder too, did they not want there to be like peace in this region? And I know it was peace agreements with the UN, but it makes me curious as to maybe they didn't want there to be peace in the area because of course we continually want war, we profit from them. There's benefits for the people in power in the US. So I saw it as that as well. That could be a potential reason.
Yeah, because I wonder if peace was established in this region, then there'd be no excuse for the U.S. to intervene and prop up whomever they were interested in. Yeah, and like we said at the beginning of the show, all the different proxy wars in the region, would that eliminate some of our influence in those types of things? It really makes you wonder if um, the U.S. is out to make sure peace isn't established in certain parts of the world
I think
for our own.
that's very much part of the plan. Absolutely,
Oh,
especially in countries where we want something.
we know
Mhm.
for a fact that that's the case. Like during the initial stages of the invasion of Afghanistan, the Taliban tried to surrender multiple times. I think it was at least two, if not more. Um, so the U.S. has specifically designed this war on terror and these covert wars in Africa to annihilate any hopes of peace and literally to just create strife so they can move the corporations in to extract the wealth and have private security firms defend them.
And one of those firms, by the way, is McKinsey and Associates, where CIA Pete Buttigieg, uh, where he worked, like immediately after graduating from Harvard, goes to work for CIA front company McKinsey and helps further destabilize Afghanistan, and then comes home and joins the Navy Reserve, where he's immediately made an intelligence officer, which is just I don't know. Jimmy Dore's done some fascinating reporting on the CIA Democrats over the last couple of years, and all of the people that come out of the intelligence community and right into Congress. I don't know if you guys saw the other day, like CNN came out with this thing that was the anti squad. And it was like 5 generic white women that were freshman congresswomen, and 3 out of the 5 have intelligence agency background. Um, and the centrist Democrats are trying to push them as the anti-squad, and it is just absolutely disgusting. And I have no idea who these people are. Like they look like they're Karen, Becky, Karen, and Karsten or whatever. It's just bad. Um, but we were talking about the destabilizing of Afghanistan. Sorry, I got off on a tangent there. Um, Go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was just going to pull it back to the leaks itself.
Okay.
And towards the bottom of the actual leak itself, it talks about the minority clans who are marginalized by those administrations should be welcomed and influenced. And it points out in the actual wiki for the leak itself about the different strategies and tactics that were used by the UIC to actually cultivate relationships with the different minor organizations. And we touched on it a little bit earlier, but a lot of the ways that they actually did it were through, even within the enemy factions, just literally developing a channel. Like they would try to find 1 or 2 people within that faction that they could work with in a cooperative manner, and then slowly start negotiating the input of their judges and their order into the system. And a lot of times it was through, at least through the UIC, through the actual religious institutions themselves, because they were a group of Sharia law judges. So this is something that they tried to do in Puntland. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, as well as Somaliland, which are two different, essentially like states, you could think of them as, inside of Greater Somalia. And what they were doing is slowly bringing in their religious influence from more or less like missionaries, to try to build up these communities and offer them some sense of stability and almost safety in a way. And it was from there that they were able to then more or less force those governments to negotiate some type of Sharia law, but they managed to maintain some autonomy and some sovereignty to enforce it in their own way. So this really goes pretty, the actual analysis of it goes pretty deep in showing how they used just tons and tons and tons of different covert and underground methods as a rebel army to really influence the whole of society to be able to slowly build up control of these areas.
It also said too in the article that was along with the leaks that the people of Somalia have been able to adapt quite well to everything that has gone on in their country since the 90s. And of course, there was things happening prior to that, but especially in the 90s, and because that's directly related to the information in this leak. And that people in Somalia have absolutely begun to realize that this foreign intervention in their country has been extremely detrimental. So they became actually less trusting of foreign intervention and foreign powers really having a say in what goes on in their countries. I just wanted to make note of that as well. It was like towards the end.
Oh, and real quick, Chris Walker in the chat, AOC is a honeypot, just gearing up to be the next Pelosi. I've been trying to tell people for a couple of years that or at least since they came into power, the Justice Democrats aren't there to wrest power away from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They're not there to conquer them. They're there to inherit the power that they have. And while there's pushback because no old lions really like to be told that corporate power will be protected with the Justice Democrats. Sorry.
And we've gone into some detail talking about
Andrew, you know quite a bit about AOC. I remember you were telling me about how, because we were talking before about how we were curious as to how she really got into her position.
Yeah. So I don't want to get into it too much, but I'll just provide a couple little examples of things that I've seen personally with her. And she doesn't support progressive candidates outside of the Democratic Party at all, and won't support any progressive candidate outside of the functioning internal Just Us Democrats. Like if you're a progressive that was like Wendy Elamay or Tim Canova or anyone else that ran as a progressive, whether you were a Democrat, Green, or Independent, you literally got ignored. Like she would go to your city and tell people to work for Justice Democrats to do phone banking instead of doing door knocking and networking and community building with local candidates. So that was the first of many big red flags to me, as far as AOC is concerned. And still to this day, you see that. And
the entire Justice Democrats ignored Paula Jean Swearengin, which really pisses me off because she had an opportunity to Joe Manchin, who is a horrible right-wing absolute crap. And I realize that Congress doesn't work for us, but it's nice to have a face in there that,
it fills a thought vacuum. It gives people desperate for someone to represent them the ability to read a tweet by somebody that has a bajillion likes and retweets on it that sounds like something you want. And that's all that the Justice Democrats have been reduced to. They prop up the Democratic Party. They herd people to support war criminals. They herd people to support the people that are directly prosecuting Julian Assange. And at the end of the day, they're not accomplishing anything. Like, they're completely compromised. They allow themselves to literally be entrapped more or less by the actual forces behind the Democratic Party with the way that their borderline money laundering schemes were set up behind the scenes. So that's I think we've actually gone into detail about that in some of the other vigils. So I think I'll refer people to those. But we should try to find those and get a good clip up of them summarizing all of it.
So I did ask people in the chat if they had any questions for us on any information on this particular leak. I'm not seeing anything, but what else would we like to touch on in here? We've kind of addressed the conclusion at the beginning ahead of time before we really got into it and touched on the history. So any other things we want to address here?
I think that's most of it. 'Cause it really, I mean, we covered almost all of the big points and most of the little ones that came out of this.
Yeah, I think the big thing to
Yeah.
take away from this is just the United States really overreaching its power and wanting and creating conflict and taking drastic measures to ensure that there is still conflict.
And something too,
Despite this article maybe not being authentic, despite that, this
Right.
article still tells us it still does, tell us at least the state of Somalia at that time. It also tells us about, the Union of Islamic Courts.
and it kind of
And
lays out a blueprint for how Islamic extremism organized itself throughout the greater Middle East in the next decade. Because you see, this is, at least to my knowledge, the first instances of the words the Islamic Republic or the Islamic State of. And right now we're fighting the Islamic State of Iran or Iraq and Syria, ISIS or ISIL, or however they're referred to in whichever international media you listen to. And that's it almost gave, whether or not the UIC was compromised by the United States intelligence agencies or they were just being fought against them and blackmailed and smeared. This document, this couple pages, I think it's 3 pages untranslated, lays out the blueprints essentially for how the United States went into other countries to build the unrest and all this terrorist and all these different terrorist organizations like ISIS, like Al-Nusra. So I think that's an important thing to pull out of this too, is we have the blueprint essentially for how they manipulated these local communities with this, even if this wasn't their own handwriting.
Yeah, and really it could have, they talk extensively, like we mentioned, about motivations for forgery in this WikiLeaks link about the actual drop. And they really said that it is hard to conclude whether it's genuine or otherwise, but it really could have been used in multiple ways, whether to cause any kind of embarrassment to the Islamic court or even to get China to really manipulate them to get involved. So this could be not even about Somalia itself and the inner workings of these clans, but really to start pulling the Chinese in more. So there's a lot of different ways that if this was a forgery, it could have been manipulated and abused in this situation.
right, and you know what? I wonder if at this time, looking back, I wonder if Julian Assange at that time wondered, oh no, could my, media organization potentially be used for political purposes? I'm sure that
Right.
that did go through his head. Perhaps it was something that he did consider prior to establishing this website. But I think that this being the first leak and his having some suspicions about its authenticity did make him wonder, this has the real potential to be used for political purposes. And I would have to say that he and staff members have done a great job at preventing that from happening, because there's leaks on everybody, and from countries all over the world. So yeah. Is there
And
any
if
last
people,
points? Yes.
I was gonna say, if people like this, like if they like us going through these drops, like almost chronologically, because there'll be anniversary dates for all of them every year. It's kind of how years work. We can keep going with this. We can do more as the anniversaries for all these different things come up, and different events come up for WikiLeaks that we can fit them into. And this is something too that I really wish that the independent media would do, because just from this one leak, we had conversations about everything. Like we talked about current news, we talked about news that happened in 2002, we talked about the 90s, we talked about 2011, we talked about the NDAA of 2020. So I think that that's it, I think this is a really cool angle to be able to take this to current news too. So
Yeah, somebody did mention in the chat, Abort You said that he does like us going through these drops and that we should go through more. And we, intended on doing so. We've talked about it. So it's definitely something that we'll, continue to do, because again, it is so important to be reflecting back on this information.
Yeah, I think our society has a very short-term memory as far as when did this news come out, where did it come from? So to go back chronologically through these drops and to just talk about them, discuss how they're relevant now, how they were relevant then, and like this one even pulled in, like, this is a story that was then used in a Hollywood movie and that everybody's seen, and it was a really big blockbuster. So I think these leaks are going to have ties into our popular culture, even that we can now look back in hindsight and say, oh, that was a lie. That's, we were being manipulated by our own Hollywood movie industry because of this story. So
yeah, because most people have seen Black Hawk Down. Most people don't know that it was written in regards to the war that was going around surrounding these leaks. So why the fuck were there even Americans to go down in Somalia in the first place?
right.
Hollywood is a part of the media too. See, the media
Yeah.
is such a broad term that we have to remember as well. And
And
we do, of course, that, Hollywood is the media, and there's reasons why they create movies at the times that they do, and that why they're spun in a certain way. And we're seeing that
and
here.
it started with Nixon a lot too. Like there were war movies and patriotic shit before then, but it really ramped up as they started doing the propaganda for the war on drugs too, because they actually created specific government funding for different TV stations to make these videos and make films like this, and different companies. So it was something that they even collaborated with them behind the scenes to make sure that the information that they were giving out was spun and accurate enough, and in even some cases would reveal like private information that wouldn't come out years later through classified information and stuff like that. So it's just really the way that they use Hollywood as a form of mainstream media to influence popular culture is
Yeah,
pretty
I think
crazy.
we could do a whole series on historically inaccurate movies that the American public has viewed that have been whitewashed by the government and the CIA, and the whole story not being told. So I think that could be its own its own very interesting series.
Look, man, Arnon, was it Milchin? Arnold Milchin, Israeli billionaire, Hollywood producer, ex-Mossad. Like it's so pervasive. The government got with Hollywood to produce propaganda going all the way back to holy shit, we have film. But World War II, man, some of the most wild propaganda films come out of World War II. And then the anti-drug commercials, or the anti-drug movies and anti-drug commercials pre-movie that happened in the 60s, like that is incredible propaganda. And now they do it a little bit more sly. Like every TV show will have a drug episode where the drug is proven to be horrible, and with the help of God and family and country, they can get off of whatever drug that is. It's so pervasive, and the NCIS is one of the longest running television shows now, and it is nothing but propaganda. Like all of
I
it.
grew up watching all of those shows: CSI, Criminal Minds, SVU.
So heavy on the propaganda. It's
Yeah.
insane, man. Real quick though, before we go to protest dates and whatnot, just a few days ago, WikiLeaks got dragged into mainstream media because they because of this Trump impeachment inquiry thing, and they're like, there was a line in the Mueller report that said Trump wanted Manafort to keep him up to date on what was going on with the WikiLeaks drops. You can read them. That doesn't mean that you're colluding with WikiLeaks or Russia on behalf of one or the other. It's on the website. Like you don't and yet this is reason for corporate media to use WikiLeaks in a sense in order to further obfuscate and drag it and remind people that they need to see the words Trump and Russia and WikiLeaks in the same sentence as often as possible so that the programming kind of settles in. It's ridiculous. It's gross.
It is, and it's like any chance that they get to just fucking sling mud, they do, which I don't understand because at the end of the day, it's going to kill them too. Like it literally gives the people the power that are prosecuting Julian to go after any of them at any time.
Yeah, somebody in the chat is saying, and I haven't seen this, but Hillary Clinton was on The View this week, and apparently she went off about Julian and WikiLeaks. Yeah,
Did she really?
I don't know what she said, so maybe we'll have to look into that for Wednesday's show to discuss.
Yeah, we'll have to.
I'm gonna promise you that people will tell me about this. I can promise you that I am not going to put myself through Hillary Clinton on The View.
That
Like
sounds
there are I am not a religious man, but if there is a hell, it is Hillary Clinton on The View.
What we should do, we should get the transcript and each pick characters from The View and then read it like
Yeah.
I'm for that. I am.
Because we're the view of like revolutionary and radical politics. Like that's kind of how I view us in relation to the rest of the media. So
sure, that'd be funny. We'll have to discuss that on Wednesday.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But I want to call out a couple save the dates and protest dates and everything coming up. So this is October 4th. October 4th is the 13th anniversary of WikiLeaks' founding. That's when, as an organization, they officially and formally formed. The 11th of this month, the 11th of October, so next Friday, a week from now, is the 6-month anniversary of when Julian Assange was taken from the Ecuadorian embassy and trafficked to Belmarsh prison. This week, the 4th through the 11th, there's a ton of different protests planned throughout the world. Candles for Assange has a lot of great information up. There's different groups that are having protests throughout now. So that's all shouted out by Unity for J. I'm going to do the best effort I can to get everything up as soon as possible on the website for that. But also some save the dates. And I apologize, I'm looking at a weird angle. I'm checking out my calendar. The 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th. Those are the dates leading up to the DNC debate that's coming up. And then in November, we have the 2nd, the 10th, or the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 16th. Those are all proposed dates by different international organizers right now for times to potentially look into getting into embassies, to influence NGOs, different things like that. So as that develops and Candles for Assange flushes that out more with some other global organizers, we'll get you news on those. But the big thing, so for this week, from the 4th to the 11th, try to get to your local media organizations the best you can. Local newspapers, local TV stations. Hang signs as much as you can outside of their buildings. If you send us your information and say, hey, I want to do this, we'll help you get signs. Whether it's from Somerset's Bean website, I have an archive on Google Drive that I can share with people. This week is going to be a really, really big push to try to get as many people acting decentralized as we can right now. And I think the best target for that, at least at this point, is local media sources. So newspapers, TV stations, radio, stuff like that, where those people are in your community. You can influence them. You can put signs up directly surrounding their buildings. So as they're driving in, they're seeing it. And if this is something that we then do in the streets and take to social media, there's so many different channels that can amplify it. So if you're one of the people that actually wants to get out there to get involved in this and aren't really sure how or when to start, getting out there this week with what you can, making signs, and putting them up around local newspapers, radios, and TV stations is a great way to help try to force people and institutions to raise awareness about Julian Assange.
And it feels really good to do so. Like, it's a really good feeling to do that and to see your work. And again, like Andrew was saying, this is the week. If you've been putting it off or pushing it off, this is the time to do it.
Because with the Democratic debates coming up, those are in Ohio, and I'm actually planning a function around them with getting friends involved out there to poster the crap out of that city. So that way it's a multi-day effort to get essentially that news to the candidates, because they're not getting it from anyone else, that people give a shit about this. And with the impeachment hearings, it gives a great chance for someone to introduce Julian Assange into the conversation on the debate stage if they so choose to talk about what Trump's actual crimes are against our country. So
Yeah, I just wanted to add that on October 11th and I believe October 21st are the next procedural hearings in London for Julian Assange. Um, like usual, we don't really know if he'll be there in person. Likely video link is what they've been doing since these. Oh, just got muted. Okay. So just keep your eye out for the information on those. We've talked a lot about how we are not getting information on these hearing dates. So if you start to see them pop up, if you start to see the news, ask your independent media to report on these procedural hearing dates. Ask them to report on what is happening in the UK and in London. That's part of the reason we as a show have talked about going to London in February of 2020, is to help get that information out, to get it to independent media, to get American media, independent media, to be reporting accurately on these hearings and this extradition hearing coming up. So
Yeah,
yeah,
the shame of Julian getting dragged out of the embassy after being sold by Lynn and Moreno uh, was that it was just Rupley there, and they were just providing footage. There's we would like to be able to talk to people on the ground. We would like to be able to get as much information as possible and immediately get it out to you guys, so that we all know what the hell is going on.
Right. And we will bring it to you in real time. Like, we would live stream updates. So you would be hearing it very quickly. And like Steve was saying, yeah, it was only Rupley who was there to capture those moments, which are pretty tough to watch. But we do need people reporting, and we do need people that are there ready to speak the truth and debunk many of the smears we know we are going to hear from the mainstream media when it comes to his extradition hearing. And it's really important with this hearing that the facts are being presented accurately, because we know that how a trial is covered in the media actually does impact that person's chance of having a fair trial. There's been studies done on this. I've done a study on this actually, and that is true. So yeah, we will definitely also post the dates on our website and on social media. So make sure you do follow Unity4J. I know Christy, that's usually tells you to go ahead and do that, but I just happened to think of that because a lot of you guys are bringing up the dates. So before we do close out with where everybody can find us, are there any last thoughts on this leak and the 13th birthday or anniversary of WikiLeaks? So I don't think so. I'll start and I will just wrap this up. So we want to thank you guys so much for joining us on this really special birthday vigil. It's amazing. It's been around for 13 years in the grand scope of things. That's really not that long at all, but they have WikiLeaks has definitely provided fantastic work. But you can also follow our organization. ActionForAssange on Twitter at action_4 Assange. And you can follow me. My name is Taylor Hudak at _Taylor Hudak on Twitter. And next Thursday, I don't know if it's live or not. It may not be, but next week I will be on Real Progressives talking about my article on the candidates. It's called Where Do They Stand? 2020 Presidential Candidates on the World's Most Persecuted Journalist. So I will be talking about with them next week. And thank you guys so much for watching.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. You can check out our website, ActionForAssange, 4 Assange.com. If you're interested in getting involved and aren't really sure how or where to start, please feel free to email me. It's actionforassange@protonmail.com. And don't forget to get out there this week and do at least one action. Get out there 1 or 2 days this week and get something up there and try to make some impact with your local media.
Yeah, I just want to say I can't believe either it's 13 years since WikiLeaks has come onto the scene. I feel like we were just celebrating and noting the 10-year anniversary, and we actually got to hear from Julian that year. And now we have another 3 years tacked on already. And now we're in a completely different situation than we were 3 years ago, or even 5 years ago. And so there is so much out there. I was putting together a thread last night of clips and quotes from Julian, and I could have been doing that for literal days. There are so many quotes, there's so many clips of him. And I didn't even get into really diving into these leaks because I knew we were going to start doing this. So we hope that you guys enjoyed going through this specific leak. We would love to keep doing that. So let us know your feedback, tweet at us, email us, and you can follow me at ChristyMKD84 on Twitter.
Yeah, happy birthday, WikiLeaks. That's we would can you imagine how much more they could have gotten away with had none of this come to light? Like it is it as much as there can be a force for tempering the evil that world governments and people in power unleash on us every single day. And we need to, as Andrew said, get out and do an action or two in the next several days. October 11th again is the 6-month anniversary of Julian being dragged out of the embassy, and there will hopefully be something going on in your area, if not be the protest in your area. Having said that, I love you all. Thank you for being a part of this. If you are just seeing me for the first time, I host a show called Slow News Day. It's also on YouTube. And you can find me on Twitter at Slow News Day Show. And yeah, that'll do.
So I just want to point out one last thing as we're closing out here. And it's the mentality of the evil ones versus the mentality of the ones that are fighting back. The billionaire class, the people that aren't concerned with the average folk, their mentality is, if I don't do it, someone else will. Like, if I don't collapse this economy, someone else will. That is the direct opposite mentality of an activist, to where to actually get out there and do it, you have to realize that if you don't do it in your city, no one else will. that there's not someone else that's going to step up for you, or someone else that you can give $5 to put something up for you. Like, this is a very real time that requires us to take unique action in our lives. And I just hope everyone through these vigils and through everything we try to do really gets inspired to do that. And I just want to say thanks for everyone for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you guys.